Hey everyone, it's time to talk about Russia a little bit and the Central Asian realm. Of course, the primary topic of this chapter is going to be Russia, the country of Russia, and they're kind of the hot topic of the world right now because of their invasion of Ukraine. So we'll get to that in just a few minutes, but I'm going to show you a couple of things here. I'm going to go through this again. I'm going to try to do it as efficiently as possible so that I don't take too much of your time. And what I want to start out with is just the vastness of how large Russia is. If you remember in our last chapter in Europe, we talked about Europe and talked about the western end of Russia is actually in Europe. And if you look at this map here, over here is Europe, and then all of this is Russia. This is all Asia. It goes from the European countries all the way to the Pacific Ocean out here near Japan. China's down here. So this is a vast country. If you were to travel from border to border, east to west of this, you're basically traveling halfway around the world. I mean, it's just vast in its size. Its population does not exactly match that physical size. Their population is not very big for such a large country, and most of that is because much of the country is really not livable. The environment is harsh. A lot of it's very cold. It lies very far north. This is the North Pole up here, so you can see this is situated very north in the northern hemisphere. And we're going to talk a little bit about those things as we go forward. One thing I do want to do is I'm going to jump over to Google Earth and just show you a little bit about the size of this. So this, of course, is North America, and this is the United States here, and then Alaska's up here. Now, Alaska's going to be important for us because Alaska is actually very close to Russia. If you don't know your history, the United States actually purchased Alaska from Russia at one point in history. I don't remember the exact year, but it was a purchase from Russia back in the days before the United States and Russia were not necessarily as hostile toward each other as they have been in more modern history. So again, this is Canada. This is the island of Greenland. And just get an idea of how big the United States is. The continental United States is down here. We're a pretty big country in the world. But as we go around the globe here, and we're going to get a little twisted up right here, this is going to be Russia. So let me reorient us. So here is Russia. Everything, the yellow boundaries are country boundaries. So everything inside this yellow boundary that has white lines, this is all Russia. This is most of the continent of Asia by percentage. Over here, this is Ukraine. This is going to be your Eastern European countries. This would be Belarus. These are your Baltic states. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are up here. Finland, Sweden, and Norway are up here. So you can see that Russia is very large and very far north. Now, this is Mongolia, and this is actually China right here, another very large country. We're going to study China in more detail in future chapters, but this little arm up here actually borders Russia. A lot of people, especially in the United States, that don't know much about mapping, don't realize that China and Russia actually border each other. Now, this is a very sparsely populated area. Nonetheless, it is a common border with Russia. These are going to be your two Koreas. North Korea is right here, South Korea is here, and these islands you see out here, that's Japan. So you can see that this country is just immense in size. And when you get that large of a country, you get a lot of different cultures within that country. You know, we say that United States, we have a lot of cultures here, but that's because of immigration. That's because people come here from different parts of the world, and we're a pretty open and free society, so people want to live here. So we get a lot of different nationalities and cultures coming to the United States. Russia is just so large geographically that it has many different cultures within its boundaries just by size alone. Of course, like I said, this is China, North Korea, Mongolia. So the people that live in the eastern part of Russia out here, again, this is very sparsely populated. There's not going to be a lot of people out here because of the conditions. However, these people are going to look and have a closer culture to your Far East countries like China than they would look like the people from this part of Russia over here, which are basically Eastern Europeans. Southern Russia, you're going to have these countries here are mostly Muslim countries, more similar to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and those countries than they would be to a European Russian. So you're seeing, because of this size, we have a lot of different interests and nationalities within this country. So again, I'm going to scroll over here just a little bit, reorient us to due north. And here is Europe again. If you remember in my lecture on Europe, we talked about Europe. We always call it a continent. However, it's really the end of a bigger continent. And you can see here how big Asia is in comparison to Europe, and then Africa's down here. So even though we call this a continent, this is really just a peninsula on the end of Eurasia, the bigger continent, the actual physical continent of Eurasia. But you see a lot of really small countries in Europe versus when you get out here, very large countries. You can see on Google Earth too the vegetation. So you're going to see up in a lot of Russia, you see green, but a lot of this northern part is going to be covered in snow and some ice in the very coastal areas during many months of the year. However, this is going to be a coniferous forest, much like the climates of Canada and northern North America. When you get down in the Central Asian countries that we talked about earlier, again, there's Mongolia. We're going to study that later. In this lesson, this is Kazakhstan. This used to be a part of the Soviet Union that we're going to go over in just a few minutes. Used to be part of the broader Russian Federation. However, now it's an independent country. You see you're getting into more arid and desert climates down in this area. So again, not a huge population in these countries. However, you're starting to change that culture more to a Middle Eastern type culture rather than a Eastern European culture. So just wanted to show you this. One other thing I want to show you, I'm going to go to the North Pole. So the North Pole is going to be somewhere right around in this area, right here. Now, we don't usually look at the map of the globe from the North Pole, but I wanted to in this case because you can see, first of all, how far north Russia is on this. Second of all, you can see here's Canada. This is Greenland. This is the continental United States down here, and this is Alaska. So you can see here between Russia and Alaska is just a few miles between these two peninsulas that jut out from each country. So it's very close up here. Now, as you know, again, I've already said this like 3 times, there's not a lot of people that live up here. So you don't have a lot of major conflict or major military activity or anything like that around this area right now. But that is increasing because the maps on Google Earth, these maps are taken of land and without sea ice. So any of the snow or ice you see is on land. So these would be islands that you see that has the snow on them. Now in the wintertime, this is all iced over, all this ocean. You can see how long the coastline is of Russia along the Arctic Ocean up here. However, these ports, first of all, there aren't any real ports. There are a few, but they're very small and really not used very much because most of the year this is iced over. Now with climate change coming on and less sea ice over time, even during the winters, Russia is banking on this opening up more. So you're going to have two results of that. First of all, you're going to have a more direct route from Asia and Russia to Canada, United States, North America. So what does that mean? Well, it could mean something militarily. Russia has been really looking around these islands, probing, claiming territory, having a lot more military drills with their Navy up in this Arctic area than they have in previous years because it's starting to open up. And they want to grab everything that they can for two reasons. One is for military and security reasons. Of course, they don't want to be this close to us in Canada. And when I say us, I'm kind of meaning North America, us and Canada together, because we're close allies, even though we're different countries. And two is because there's a lot of minerals under this ocean, a lot of oil and gas reserves. We really don't know how much because it hasn't been intensely explored yet because of the conditions, but as the climate warms up, they are probing this more, and they're finding more and more natural resources up here, and of course they want to stake claim to those as well. So this is something that we will talk about in this chapter, and it will be on your assignments about climate change and what Russia is hoping for and what they think they might gain out of it. So just want to jump over to Google Earth really quickly to show you that. And now we're going to get into the slideshow here. Again, this is just the same map that I just showed you. It's just a political map that has countries on it. Not very readable because of the scope of this. But let me see. I'm going to go through some of these slides pretty quickly like I usually do. So again, geographically it's challenged. Even though it's so immensely large, there's just not a lot of people here. It's very harsh out in this area where there are no people. That's where there are no people. The population of the whole country is around 231 million. It's in a state of decline. People are leaving. That's probably more true now since they invaded Ukraine. A lot of people are trying to get out of Russia that don't agree with the war, especially a lot of men are trying to get out of Russia because they don't want to be drafted into the military to go fight a war that they don't want to fight in. So basically, Russia has 9 political units. They have a greater Russia, and they kind of have, you could call them states or territories that they kind of course, you can see Moscow is over in this area. So you can see how far this is. So they kind of let these territories have their own laws and do their own things. They're just under the control of Moscow. So these states or territories out here really kind of run themselves. They're just under the umbrella of Russia. There's 3 nations in Central Asia in what they call Transcaucasia, and that's between the Black Sea here and the Caspian Sea. Their countries are right here. Those would be Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And then we have 5 countries, what we call the Central Asian countries. And those are the countries I pointed out were more similar to the Middle Eastern or countries like Afghanistan. They're Muslim countries. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, a few others down here I'll go over all these in just a few minutes. But these are down here in what we call Central Asia. They used to be part of the Soviet Union, which was basically Russia with satellite states under a communist rule. But they are now, since 1992, they are independent nations. And again, we have a lot of different nationalities and cultures within this area. Now you can kind of break the physiographic regions up there, the physical geography of this. Remember I talked about the Ural Mountains back in the European chapter? That was always, when I studied the continents, when I studied geography when I was young, we studied the Ural Mountains, were kind of the boundary between what we considered Europe and Asia. So you see a good part of Russia, a small percentage overall, but still a chunk of Russia lies west of the Ural Mountains and closer to Eastern Europe. This would be Belarus, Ukraine, Poland. So in addition to that, the majority of the population of Russia lives in this area as well. So this is the core area of Russia in this part, what we used to refer to as European Russia. So this Russian plain, as they call it, that's an extension of the European plain, the Northern European plain. Moscow is the capital. It's right here. And it references the Caucasus Mountains, which is going to be down here between the Caspian and the Black Seas, near the 3 countries that I mentioned before. Now here is just a map of Europe that we studied in the last chapter. And these were kind of the boundaries. Again, here's the Ural Mountains. So you can see this would be Western Russia, where most of the people live. You're going to have more of your Eastern European type culture here. It's closely related to Eastern Europe. Ukraine is right here. So that's where the war is going on now. And I want to tell you right now, before I go any further, before I forget, I'm not going to talk about the Ukraine-Russia war right now in this presentation, but be sure that you watch the videos that I assigned for this chapter, because they will be in your assignments and on the test. So be sure to watch those and get yourself caught up on the Ukraine-Russian conflict. I'll mention a little bit in this presentation, but I'm not going to focus on it like those videos will. And then down here you have the Caucasus Mountains. And this is where I said those other countries of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia lie between Europe, Turkey, and the Middle East. So this is a very important region because it's always had unrest. Even when it was the Soviet Union back in the day, these were part of the Soviet Union, but they always were kind of fighting with the Soviet Union for independence. They never really bought into being part of Russia back in those days. So that area is pretty important as far as the political history of the Soviet Union. The West Siberian Plain, I'm going to let you read over some of this in your textbook. I don't have a lot of time to go into detail on this. These are the physiographic regions, again, of Russia. Just be a little bit familiar with these. Again, this part out here is very sparsely populated. And Russia has big plans for this area with climate change coming on the horizon. They think that climate change is going to help their country moving forward because it's going to open up more of this typically frozen area to things like agriculture and industry. Now, they think that. Nobody knows that for sure. Climate change is a big unknown for the world, and that's why it's so dangerous. Yes, in theory, it sounds good that, yeah, okay, well, it's going to get warmer, so we're going to have less snow and ice, so these areas are going to warm up and it's going to be farmable. Yeah, it sounds good. But climate change, as it changes the temperature, also changes weather patterns. So nobody knows what's going to happen to these areas when they warm up. Will they become a desert? Will they lose precipitation because it's warmer? Will they gain precipitation? Nobody knows. So that's purely speculation on their part, and it's kind of a dangerous gamble to be taking when you're kind of relying on something like climate change to possibly improve your situation. Again, you've got some of the Central Europe or Central Asian countries: Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. You've got the Eastern Highlands, which is going to be out here in the Mongolia area and just east of Mongolia. You've got the Kamchatka Peninsula right here. And down here at Sakhalin Island, I'm not sure if I'm even saying that right, but there's a lot of natural oil and gas reserves around that island. Take note of that because it's going to be a question on your test, and for some reason in previous semesters people tend to miss that question for some reason. So that's an important thing to note. So here's your climate. Now again, if you remember when we talked about Europe, I told you that much of Europe has a very similar climate scheme as the eastern part of the United States, even here in Kentucky, even though it's located considerably further north than we are. And if you remember, I told you that was because of that ocean current that flowed from the Atlantic Ocean up the eastern coast of the U.S. It crosses the ocean and goes up to Great Britain and along the northeastern coast of Europe. So that's why they have a pretty moderate climate there. But as you go away from that ocean current into the interior of this immense continent, you lose that effect from that ocean current. So now you're starting to see the true climate that should exist on a landmass located this far north. As you see, the aqua blue here is tundra. So that is just ice, snow, permafrost. So that's always frozen, at least for now, until climate change might change that in a few years. But right now it is. Your D climates are going to be more of your humid cold climates. That's what you're going to find in Canada a lot. So that's much further north than we are in North America, but that is what dominates Russia. Is your humid cold climates. And then you see as you get southern or more south in Russia, down around the Central Asian countries, you're seeing these arid and semi-arid climates down here to the south of Russia. So because they're so far north, really cold winters, it's dark a lot longer. You know, we complain about it getting dark at 4:30 here in the winter. They have a lot shorter days there because of their latitude. And the summers tend to be pretty short, and they have a pretty short growing season as well. And here is that term that I just described in the previous slide, continentality. That is when the inland climate, like I said, you're getting away from that ocean influence. It's more of a true climate for that latitude. It's not being affected by the oceans whatsoever. And in permafrost, I mentioned that's when the water in the ground is permanently frozen, so you can't really dig a hole in it. You get ice almost immediately. And I'm going to let you kind of read through these. I've already mentioned several of these on the previous slides, but you can look at the climate descriptions in your textbook. Now, when we're talking about population distribution, as I mentioned, this is a closer view of the last map that we had on the last slide. The darker the color, the more people there are per square mile per acre. They have per square kilometer on here. So the more people per square kilometer you see in the darker colors. So if you remember, Russia's boundary is pretty much all of this up here. So you see there's not hardly any people living out here in this area. You see a few dots out here. These are isolated cities. Probably have some of the prison camps, the gulags that you've heard about in the news might be up there. Over here you get closer to Eastern Europe. Moscow is right here, so you have a bigger population in this area. Ukraine's going to be down here. So this is going to be the Ural Mountains right here. So you can see most of the people live west of the Ural Mountains. As you come down here, you get some more population in your Central Asian countries. Kazakhstan has some regions that are larger. You see the Caucasus states down here. Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia have a little bit higher population densities. Now that doesn't mean they're just packed with people. That just means they have more people living per square kilometer than you're going to see in much of Russia right here. So here is that shot from the North Pole again. And here are some of the things. Again, I've already mentioned these on previous slides. They're really thinking that climate change might be helpful to them. The pink here is continuous permafrost, so that means the groundwater is frozen year-round in this area right here. The white, it's frozen part of the year, so you can see that is getting down almost, that's the northern boundary of the United States right there, and this is Canada. So you can see here that they think the climate change might help them, but again, that's a gamble because we don't know what it's going to do to precipitation events. We also don't know what it's going to do to that permafrost, because if you think about something, when it's frozen, it's saturated with water. So it thaws, it's going to be really muddy. So those areas for probably years, if not decades, are going to be pretty unusable until that moderates out. Some of that moisture gets out of the ground. On top of that, what we're finding is there are vast amounts of methane stored in this permafrost. And as it's melting, it is accelerating the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. So not only are we affecting it with the chemicals that we put in the air from human use, but as we have started this snowball, pardon the pun, rolling down this hill, we're accelerating the natural processes of greenhouse gases getting released from their stored capacity. They're frozen in this permafrost. They're now escaping more and more and more as it gets warmer into the atmosphere. So that's just increasing climate change that much more. if you look back into the early 2000s and even the 1990s, a lot of the projections and models that we had on climate change going out several decades, we're actually exceeding those. We're getting warmer faster. We're losing ice faster than those models predicted. And a big reason for that is those models did not take into account the amount, and we really didn't know the amount of methane that was stored in this permafrost. And if you look online and in news articles, you can find some examples of large areas, large sinkholes that have formed in northern Russia because so much methane has escaped over time. It's created such a void in the ground that it caused the sinkhole to just fall in. So just keep that in mind on your test, because there's going to be a question on that on your assignments and your test as well. Let's see. I've already mentioned most of that. So physical geography, again, this is just a map showing oil and gas reserves and potential oil and gas reserves, and you can see out here around this island that I mentioned before is one of those. Some of it in Siberia, northern Siberia right here, and then a lot of it's going to be down here in your Caucasus area. Some of that is already being produced, and some of it is being explored. A lot of Russia's, I say Russia, the Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union, a lot of those now free countries that broke away from the Soviet Union, broke away from Russia when it dissolved in 1992, and even parts of Europe have relied heavily on Russian energy exports. And that's one of the reasons that this Ukraine invasion and the United States and its allies supporting Ukraine has been a little bit difficult to navigate politically, just because a lot of Europe got a lot of their energy, oil and gas, from Russia. So part of the political demands that we had to have to get everybody on the same page was to make sure that Europe had a reliable energy source going into this past winter without Russian energy, because that was a very real potential that they could be cut off from Russian energy altogether. And you can see here, again, this is a map of the distribution of those energy sources. Here's just a closer view of that map, a little bit bigger, so you can see these. And again, you see a lot down here in the Caucasus area, some up north, and you can see they're starting to find some up in the Arctic Ocean. As the ice melts more and more, they're going to find more and more of those reserves up there. So I'm not going to talk too much about the history of Russia. You're going to read that in your textbook, but just keep in mind that a lot of Eastern European countries were heavily influenced by Russia. And if you remember back when we talked about North America, South America, and then I mentioned it again in Europe, Europe was so instrumental in their imperialism or colonization of different areas and their effects on different cultures, and they're bringing their religion, their languages, and all that to these different parts of the world. Well, Russia really didn't have that on the scale that Europe did. However, their culture and their language and their customs did bleed out into countries like Finland, Belarus, Poland, a lot of the Eastern European countries, and down in your Central Asian countries as well. So there was a little bit of Russian imperialism, but it was much closer to their borders than, say, the Europeans that sailed across the ocean to a different hemisphere and expressed their views, I'll put it really gently, over in those distant lands. So even into China, they had some of this imperialism going on in the Far East. So here is just a map of some of the different ethnic backgrounds that you can see. Again, you can see this in your textbook. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but a lot of it's on the periphery of the country, along the borders, and some of those countries that were taken by the Soviet Union back in the day. And the orange is Russian, of course, so you can see the Russian influence there. So the Soviet experiment, this was basically from 1922 to 1991-92, and it was a communist regime. It was communism. It was called the Soviet Union. Even when I was young, we referred to it as Russia. Russia was the biggest country and the controlling country. However, the Soviet Union encompassed several other countries now that have their liberty, their freedom away from Russia, as you can see in the map today. So this is Russia, all the solid color here. You have 3 Eastern European countries, the Baltic nations up here, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. These are your Eastern European countries now. Belarus, if you remember from our last lesson, is an Eastern European country. It's its own country, but it's basically a puppet of Russia. It could just as easily be a Russian state right now. They're so close to the thing. Then you have Ukraine. Down here you have Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Those are now independent countries. And here you have the 5 Central Asian countries that I've already mentioned. So all of this was the Soviet Union back in the day. Then they had a kind of an alliance of countries they also controlled that weren't part of the Soviet Union, but they were called the Iron Curtain. And those countries were kind of like our NATO countries today, even though it was not as voluntary as you would like to think. They called it their Iron Curtain, their group for security. However, these countries really didn't have an option. They were controlled by pro-Russian governments like Poland, like Yugoslavia, Romania. Those Eastern European countries were part of the Iron Curtain. Here are some of the history. Again, I'm not going to go into this in detail in this presentation because I don't want to take too much time. But it was a communist regime. It was full-on communism. Along China adopted that model, and they were very close with Cuba as well here, very close to the Florida coast of the United States. In December 1991, so I'll mention 1992, basically these countries kind of took their independence back, kind of not by force, but because in December of 1991 the Soviet Union imploded. Mikhail Gorbachev was the president at the time. He was a very progressive president. He understood that the Russian economy, or the Soviet economy, was not very good, and he moved the Soviet Union toward its dissolution. And these countries then declared their independence that you see today that are independent. Ukraine was very important to this because Ukraine, if you remember in our last lesson on Europe, they had a lot of resources that the Soviet Union needed. A lot of arable farmland, a lot of natural resources, oil and gas, that the Soviet Union really depended on. So when Ukraine declared its independence, it really hurt the country of Russia. They introduced free markets. They tried to move toward capitalism. It was a very tough time for Russia when they transferred over. It's a very poor country. They didn't have a lot of infrastructure. And as a lot of third world countries go, and it wasn't considered a third world country. However, it had the economy of a third world country. It was extremely impoverished and extremely corrupt. If you know anything about third world countries and you travel like I do to third world countries, you know everything is corrupt. Everybody gets paid off for something. Even if you get pulled over by the police in a third world country, you slip them a 20 and they'll let you go. I mean, even down to that level, and it only gets worse as you go up in the governments there. So again, there's over 100 nationalities within the Russian boundary. So you have a lot of different cultures, even languages that are spoken within Russia. Although most of Russia does speak Russian, some of the people have a secondary language that's more common in their individual areas. So I'm just kind of reading through this to see what I want to mention to you. So satellite states, I would mention again, Belarus would be considered a satellite state of Russia right now. They said that about the former Baltic states, which again is up here, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But they have become more European now, more independent of Russia, And they're pretty nervous right now because what happened in Ukraine, if Russia were successful in Ukraine, these countries would probably be next. Because Ukraine is pretty much giving Russia all it wants right now, and Russia is definitely not winning this war right as we speak, it's less likely these countries have anything to worry about in the short term. In addition, these countries are part of NATO. So if Russia did attack these countries, it's going to be on basically with Europe and the United States if they do try to attack any of these countries. So that's a big difference in those countries versus Ukraine, which was not in NATO when this conflict started. And I just mentioned NATO. You have a lot of Islamic activity on the southern boundary down here in these states. These states were always kind of, when I say these states, I'm talking about the Caucasus area, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and then the Central Asian, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. These countries were always kind of like the Wild West of Russia. Even though they were part of the Soviet Union, these cultures did not buy in to the Soviet model. They are always on the edge of rebelling against the Soviet Union. They were only put down by force and just blanketed with military force to keep that from happening. So these countries, once Soviet Union kind of fell apart, they did their own thing. And currently, they all have pretty good ties with Russia, as far as I know, except for Georgia and Armenia. Azerbaijan is kind of in the middle, but Georgia especially, Russia tried to invade Georgia back, I think it was in 2007, the early 2000s. Fought some there, it wasn't very successful. And so all these areas down here in Central Asia have traditionally kind of not liked the idea of the Soviet Union and fought back against Russia. Now in 2014, Crimea, which this is the Crimean Peninsula, this is the Black Sea right here. This was part of Ukraine until 2014. In 2014, first of all, there are a lot of ethnic Russians that live on this peninsula. They are Ukrainian, but they also identify as Russian. This is very important for seaport, trade, military activities, and Russia went in and militarily took it from Ukraine, and pretty much nobody did anything about it. If we would have, I say we, I mean the free world, meaning Europe, United States, basically your NATO countries, even though Ukraine was not part of NATO, if we would have supported Ukraine back then as strongly as we are now and allowed Ukraine to keep the Crimean Peninsula, it's likely that Russia probably wouldn't have invaded Ukraine this past year. However, this was done pretty easily, and they probably got emboldened because of this, and that probably emboldened them to attack Ukraine this past year. So this is currently a very hot topic, the Crimean Peninsula, because Ukraine has done so well in this war. The idea is that they're going to take the Crimean Peninsula back. That's their goal. Now, if that happens or not, I don't know. Some military advisors advise against that. Some say go for it, go ahead and do it. But it's very important because the Russians built a bridge over this strait right here that enters the Sea of Azov. And that kind of cut off some of these ports because this bridge is so low that big tankers can't get under it. So if you really watch a lot of news, you probably saw that some Ukrainians blew up part of this bridge about probably 4 or 5 months ago. They've since rebuilt it, but this is going to be a hot topic going forward in the Ukrainian war if Ukraine is actually going to take this back. Now, you might think, well, it was already part of Ukraine before. It should be easy to take it back. Well, the Russians have had 7 or 8 years to build up their defenses in here, so they're a lot stronger on this peninsula than they are invading Ukraine up here. So it's going to be harder than it sounds to go ahead and take this back, but they basically have said they're going to go for it once they get the chance. So again, I've already mentioned this. These are some of the energy pipelines that you're going to see from Russia to Europe, and you can see there's a whole lot. Germany, Poland, all the way to France and Benelux up here, you see a lot of gas pipelines. Now, there were a couple that were being worked on when this invasion started, especially there was one in Germany, and they basically put a stop to that. They said, nope, we're not going to do it. I don't know this one in Turkey. I don't know what's going to happen with that one. Turkey's they're in NATO. They're kind of hot and cold on Russia and how they're supporting Ukraine. But more or less, there's been a moratorium put on Russian energy since this invasion started. And slowly but surely, that's going to deprive them of money and funds to fight this war. So that's one of the big economic weapons that the world has against Russia if they stop buying their oil and gas. So again, I've already mentioned this. This is that North Pole model again. You see here several of the places that are the Russians are setting up bases in the Arctic Ocean that weren't usable before, but now they may be. So you can see they're kind of going out and, I guess, setting their territory, so to speak, on a lot of these islands and in the Arctic Ocean. So here are your primary regions of Russia and Central Asia both. So you have the Caucasus right here, Transcaucasia is what they call that. That's their 3 Caucasus countries. Here's your Central Asian ones. We've already mentioned this, which is going to be Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And then the other ones are all in Russia. The far eastern part of Russia is going to include your boundary area with China in the Kamchatka Peninsula, southern Siberia, northern Siberia, and the Russian core, which is west of the Ural Mountains over here. And this is just a little bit closer view of that. So I've already mentioned this as well. You basically have several different states, and you see it's divided in these bigger political areas. Far Eastern, Siberian, Urals, Volga, I cannot pronounce that word. The Central. So these are your primary regions and how they break up their governments. And the farther away you get from Moscow, probably the less control and less influence there is from the Russian core over here. However, the Russians have built a pretty substantial railroad system across their entire country, where it's feasible to do so they can conduct trade across these areas. So I do want to mention Chechnya real quick. The Russian Federation Treaty. Chechnya is a separatist area in Russia. They're more closely related to your Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, those countries. They also have a lot of activity around the Transcaucasia area, and they have always fought back against Russian rule. It's very interesting right now. I just wanted to mention this in Ukraine right now. So, as you all know, in today's world, money can buy you anything. So, the Chechens were pretty primitive in their organization. They kind of had a feudal system where they have basically local areas or kind of little kingdoms, different cities that had their own militias and own leaders. And there was one leader. Their fighting tactics are very brutal. They're very, very hard fighters to deal with. And most Chechens do not like Russians. And they have fought and made terrorist attacks on Russia in history. There is one warlord in Chechnya that actually was loyal to Putin because he's basically getting paid to be that way. So he fights all the other Chechen militias. So there's kind of a civil war going on between the Chechens. That civil war has spilled over into Ukraine. because that warlord has provided troops and units to go in and fight for Russia in Ukraine. And when the other Chechen groups found out about this, they sent their own units to fight this guy's units in Ukraine. So part of them are fighting on Ukraine's side, and then this one warlord is fighting against Ukraine for Russia. So you can see how complicated this is getting already just from this one area. So back in 2000, they kind of redid their geographic framework, and it kind of points out the regions that I told you about just before this. Again, you can read more about this in your textbook, talking more detailed about the centralized government and the Chechens and their problems with the Russian government. Population, again, it's in decline. I'm not going to go into great detail on this map. Just kind of reading through these to see if there's anything I want to mention in this lecture. This is just talking about the different regions within Russia. You can see here's some manufacturing regions. The Ural Mountains are here, so you can see most of it is in the Russian core over here. There are a few over near some of the larger cities in this area. Now, when I say larger cities in the Siberian area, that means there are large cities for Siberia, not for the rest of the world. They're probably actually pretty small population, but they are located near natural resources. Therefore, they have a manufacturing center around those areas. The Volga region, that's the primary river in western Russia. Of course, we've mentioned the Urals. So the Urals is an ancient mountain chain. It's going to have a lot of your mineral wealth that you typically find in a mountain type setting. Let's see. And anything I'm skipping over, you'll read about in your textbook. I just want to make sure I don't take too much of your time. This is just talking about, this is kind of specifics about each of the different regions within Russia. The Far East, again, pay attention to this map. This is going to be on your test. The island here, you can see there's oil and gas reserves all around this island. That's going to be a question. For some reason, people don't read that map very well, but just remember that they have a significant oil and gas field out in the very eastern part. Again, down here's Japan. This is the Kamchatka Peninsula out here. This is China. So we're in the far east at the Pacific Ocean. Here's Transcaucasia. Again, this is not part of Russia currently. This is Russia here. And here are your states of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Georgia is, I think it's Christian Orthodox. Armenia is Christian. Azerbaijan is a Muslim country. And you can see here, there's transition areas, there's disputed areas. These countries don't really get along all that well between the three of them. If you know your history very well, you know Turkey back in history, last probably century, had a genocide against Armenian cultured people in eastern Turkey. So you might see that. It was in the news recently, probably a year or two ago, because I think the United States government, Congress, actually voted to recognize that as a genocide for some reason. It was clearly a genocide. I'm not saying they shouldn't have. I don't know why they have to actually vote on it, but for whatever reason they did, and it kind of made Turkey mad, and it was kind of a big deal within NATO as far as us recognizing that as a genocide. And here's a reference to the war that Russia invaded Georgia, and it was pretty costly for Russia. They didn't do too well in that war either. Here we go. Yeah, Christian Orthodox is in Georgia. They regularly fight with Russia. Azerbaijan has a lot of oil reserves. It's a Muslim country. And Armenia, again, is a Christian country, which is pretty rare in this part of the world. You see Iran, Iraq, Turkey. This is pretty much bordering the Middle East right here. And here are your Central Asian countries that I've already mentioned several times in this. There's a lot of ethnic complexity in this area. It's primarily Muslim. It's going to have Turkic influences, which means from Turkey and the Middle East. And it's more closely related, the people and the culture, to your Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan type countries rather than Russia. And here are some of the specifics about each of the countries and what they have or do well with regards to resources. And here are some ideas, initiatives by China. China recognizes that Russia has a lot of resources up here. And of course, China's always, any country really, in any business for that matter, is always looking to improve themselves and have a better outlook and more resources. So they're exploring building roads across the area. They might say it's for commerce or, out of the goodness of their hearts, but they're wanting to access these resources and open up their trade routes a lot better so that they can make more money and have more resources to deal with. So you see that's by land. They're looking at sea routes. We're going to learn later about some of these sea routes over here in this area that are highly contested. And that's all for this chapter. So I'm hoping that the time was a little better on this, but we got more of the detail of what we need to talk about. Remember to watch the videos on the Ukraine-Russian conflict. Watch the news. Go on YouTube. The last video I think I have in your lesson was from a couple of months ago. Look for an update on a more recent news source, maybe the last couple of weeks. There's always updates on this. Ukraine has been more than holding its own against Russia, even driving Russia back out of most of the territory that it took in the beginning. Russia has started a second major offensive within the last week or two. So it's kind of stalemating again, and a lot of fighting is starting to flare up. I did see our president visited there just a few days ago. So that's something that's very abnormal for a sitting president to visit a war zone in which the United States has no active duty people in. It's not part of the conflict. So that's a noteworthy news item from the last week or so. So check on that, watch your videos, and as always, if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.